todos los asistentes en este auditorio, así como a través de nuestras redes sociales de la Universidad del Bosque. Bienvenidos a esta charla denominada Género y Violencia contra la Mujer en el Mundo Islámico, organizada por la Escuela de Gobierno y Sociedad de la Facultad de Ciencias Jurídicas y Políticas y la Facultad de Medicina. En esta oportunidad contamos con la honorable presencia de la doctora Qanta Ahmed, quien es graduada en Medicina de la Universidad de Nottingham, Inglaterra, y médico practicante tanto en el Reino Unido, Estados Unidos y Arabia Saudita, así como profesora asociada de NYU Langone Long Island School of Medicine. La doctora Ahmed no solo ha destacado por su ejercicio de la medicina en el campo específico de desórdenes del sueño, sino también como comentarista en cadenas de noticias como Fox News en Estados Unidos o la BBC de Inglaterra. Igualmente ha incursionado en el mundo de la literatura con la publicación de sus memorias durante una corta estadía de 2 años en el Reino Saudí tituladas In the Land of Invisible Women. Sin duda alguna, si hay una actividad que le ha valido un prestigioso lugar en la opinión internacional es su activismo por los derechos de las mujeres musulmanas y su oposición a las formas radicalizadas del Islam como el yihadismo y el terrorismo islamista. Esperamos que en medio de un convulso contexto para la cultura, la política y las sociedades musulmanas, la doctora Ahmed nos pueda arrojar luces sobre cuestiones que atañen tanto a la medicina como a la ciencia política. En el orden del día daremos inicio con una breve introducción de la doctora Ahmed para luego pasar a una sesión de preguntas y finalmente una ronda de preguntas del público. A todos bienvenidos y gracias por su asistencia. Dr. Qanta, on behalf of the head director of the university, the dean of the Faculty of Law and Political Science, and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine as well, welcome to Colombia, and more importantly, welcome to our university. We are very honored by your presence today, so please feel free to start with your introduction to your talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this, and it's an incredible honor to be the first time in the Republic of Colombia for me, the first time in South America for me, and the first time that I'm taking a class with both medical students and political science students. Could you show me with your hands who are the medical students, please? And I continue to be a student of medicine, even as an associate professor. And show me who are the political science students. Okay, and I'm an amateur political science student, so that's fantastic. At the end of this, I want you to make friends, because this opportunity of medicine and political science, I never even imagined would become such an important hybrid in many of my pursuits. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, I will talk to you about my nearly 25-year history of trying to understand radicalization and what I term Islamism throughout the Muslim majority world, which started when I saw September 11th in Saudi Arabia, where I was working as an intensive care medicine doctor. And that's been a very long journey, which has taken me to the communities impacted by Al-Qaeda. They are still my patients in New York. Communities that were impacted by the Taliban, including children indoctrinated into Taliban ideology. Communities that underwent genocide in the name of ISIS in terms of the Yazidi community, which was almost erased by the ISIS genocide. Are you able to hear on the microphone? Is the microphone on? Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me about the translation. Sorry. I will stop and see whether my translation expert is going to be able to summarize that. Pardon me. Thank you.
Okay, sí, fueron varias cosas. Pero inicialmente dice que está muy honrada de estar acá. Es su primera vez en Colombia, su primera vez en Sudamérica. Le llama mucho la atención el hecho de que pues haya esta unión entre estudiantes de ciencia política y estudiantes de medicina, que nunca se imaginó que, digamos, estas dos áreas podrían confluir, y quería compartir con ustedes sus 25 años de historia y de experiencia en el trabajo que hace. Ha trabajado con diferentes comunidades en ambientes de violencia, vale la pena resaltar el trabajo que hizo con las comunidades yazidíes, que casi fueron eliminadas, borradas completamente por ISIS.
And we're going to have a complex dialogue on that. However, I was invited to Colombia to continue bearing witness to the violence perpetrated by an Islamist group you've heard of, known as Hamas. And so you're going to see the evidence that I gathered a few days after October 7th as documentation of what they perpetuated on that day. And I'm going to share some movies and some forensic evidence that I've brought to the attention of your lawmakers and leaders in your community, which is part of my work as someone exposing Islamism. And so I would ask, I understand this talk is being live streamed. When you see images, please treat them with respect rather than just some moment on social media. This is really the testimony of people that I gathered who were living and also the testimony that I gathered from the dead.
Entonces, ahora el tema que vamos a hablar es un poco complejo porque trata sobre la violencia que ha ejercido un grupo que tal vez todos ustedes conozcan, que se llama Hamas. Ella trajo evidencia que quiere compartir con ustedes, que también quiere compartir con los tomadores de decisiones y legisladores aquí del país. Quiere pedirles el favor, muy especialmente, que las imágenes que van a ver las traten con mucho respeto.
I'm going to ask for the lights to be lowered and we will play a first clip. This is October 20th and I'm being asked to see a place where atrocities were committed in a family home.
Entonces, quiere pedir que bajen la luz. Por favor, la imagen que vamos a ver es de octubre 20, donde se cometieron atrocidades en una casa de familia.
All of a sudden, 7 o'clock in the morning, those Hamas people came here and bombed the house and tried
Bombed the house.
with emission. Now what you see here, because the soldier came and the Hamas was inside, so they ran over with the bulldozer to make him run away outside. Yeah.
However, also I see these bullet holes in the wall.
Yes, this is a house that took plenty of bullets.
There's a window there that seems to be pushed in.
Yes.
And many bullet holes here, even up there.
Yes, they bombed the whole house because they want to go inside.
The front lawn.
Yes, we can go see here. Those peace people that live here, very peace people. Now maybe come you see here. This is a okay.
So I'm entering a home.
What do you see here? What do you see here? Here this is
Entonces están entrando en una casa.
ocean of blood. What you see here? This is blood. What you see? It's become black right now. This is blood.
So I'm
There was
entering a home.
plenty of
Están
blood
entrando en
here.
una casa.
I'm on the threshold of a home and we're
Yes.
coming into focus.
Estoy en el umbral de la casa, ya estamos enfocando.
Welcome. I will go inside first. Let me see if you don't have a.
Estoy
Come
en el
over
umbral
here,
de la
come
casa,
over
ya
here,
estamos
come over
enfocando.
We may need it a little darker because we can't see.
Tal vez necesitamos un poquito menos de luz
So
porque
we'll
no se puede
lower the
ver.
lights. And yes, please.
Sí, así está bien.
Just for the couple of footage. So I have entered a home, if you want to translate that,
Entonces
please.
acabo de entrar, aquí estoy entrando a este hogar
And I'm stepping over the threshold.
y estoy pasando el
Come
umbral.
over here. Come over here. Come over here. This is a family. It's very small, but I will walk in. This is a family. Look, the blood.
Aquí es una familia, miren
This is
la
inside
alfombra.
the
Esto es dentro
family house.
de la casa de
Look, the
familia,
blood here.
toda la sangre.
I'm here 13 days after these
They attacked
events.
the
Estoy
house
aquí 13 días después de
from
este
the two
evento.
places, from here
Atacaron la
and
casa
from
desde
there.
los dos lugares, de aquí y de
Also,
allá. También.
From everywhere.
de todas partes.
I don't know. When I see the blood,
No lo sé, cuando veo
you
la sangre,
see, come with me, come with me, come with me.
vengan
I will-
conmigo.
Look,
Miren,
they stab people, honest
ellos
people,
acuchillaron gente
peace
inocente.
people. When they
Esta gente,
look,
There were
they kill
many
them with a knife.
knives on the scene.
All this is blood.
había muchos cuchillos en la escena.
You cannot see, but on the kitchen
No
cabinet
pueden
are
ver,
two
pero en-
religious Jewish objects.
Yes, because there was
A
walking
Hanukkah
inside,
and a
walking
menorah.
En
around.
la alacena de la cocina había dos objetos religiosos. Una menora.
And we'll just stop this movie here, it goes on.
Y voy a parar acá,
And
esto sigue.
For those of you that might want to study more, all of these data and evidence now is in the possession of the Israeli consulate, and it also can be accessed through the Shoah Foundation. For anybody that wants to study this seriously, it's a resource now to Colombia.
Para todos los que quieran estudiar esto, todo este material ya está disponible en el consulado israelí y en la Israel Foundation para que todo el que quiera acceder pueda acceder ahí a este material y más por ahí.
Thank you. We're going to see another room in the same house.
Vamos a ver
And-
otra habitación de la misma
And
casa.
when I saw it, I didn't really understand what the room represented until some months later.
Y cuando estaba ahí todo, no entendía lo que representaba esta habitación, solo lo hice unos meses después.
There is no sound
No hay sonido
on this movie.
en este clip.
This is what is known as a safe room that is built into many of these houses.
Esto es lo que se conoce como un cuarto seguro, una sala segura que se construye en muchas de estas casas.
As a bomb shelter.
Es como un refugio contra bombardeos.
These look like trunks or shorts.
Estos parecen que son algún tipo de vestimentas.
That is a a steel window to keep out, actually just to keep out shrapnel from aerial missiles. But you see bullet holes.
Esa ventana está reforzada para evitar que caigan las izquierdas, pero así se pueden ver balas, hoyos de balas.
There's a family picture on the wall, but I did not want that to be in focus. And you see on the mattress very, very deep blood stains.
Hay una foto familiar en la pared, pero yo no quería enfocar eso para que no se viera y pueden ver que hay manchas de sangre en el colchón.
In a very focal area, in contrast to the pool of human blood that was across the kitchen and dining room.
En un área muy focal en contraste con toda la cantidad de sangre que había en la zona de la cocina y de la sala.
And so it wasn't until we began to learn that sexual violence occurred on October 7th that did I go back to this data and realize this was probably a place where sexual violence had occurred, because there were no other clothes in the room, there was no wardrobe, there was no laundry. Somebody was forcibly taken there, stripped and violated.
Y no fue hasta que entendimos que hubo violencia sexual en octubre 7 que entendí que en esa habitación muy probablemente se dieron temas de violencia sexual. Alguien fue arrastrado a esa habitación, desnudado y abusado.
I looked at many of these houses and places where Hamas had been just some days earlier, and in fact, while I was there, they were still apprehending some Hamas terrorists in that Gaza envelope area.
Yo estuve en muchos hogares y en muchos sitios que también tuvieron que sufrir los ataques de estos terroristas de Hamas, y en unos incluso hubo sitios en los que estaban arrestando a terroristas de Hamas que aún estaban en esa área.
As I was leaving, I saw a civilian coming back to his home, Mr. Dror Shayesh, and actually he agreed for me to record his testimony of what happened to him and his family that day that survived almost a 12-hour siege while Hamas was on a rampage outside their home and neighborhood.
Cuando me iba, tuve la oportunidad de encontrarme con el señor de la foto, quien accedió a darme una entrevista y contarme su testimonio sobre cómo estuvo 12 horas, tuvo que soportar un asedio de 12 horas de Hamas con su familia en su casa.
And so if there's one lesson you can take away from me today is your job as a medical student, as a doctor, or as a scientist of political science is to look at evidence and bear witness. Maybe not pass any opinion, just understand what reality transpired before you decide to formulate either a clinical opinion or a political science opinion. So listening and asking and inquiring, that's actually the central tenet of medicine. Is to, most of the diagnosis is in the history of the patient. Very little is from the examination. And similarly, when you're looking at these complex problems, you must go to the survivors, you must go to those that did not survive, you must go to the places where this occurred in any conflict situation.
Si hay algo que quiero que aprendan hoy de mí como tanto doctores como politólogos es que la realidad hay que conocerla y conocerla en su totalidad antes de emitir una opinión. Los doctores tienen que primero entender qué es lo que está sucediendo antes de emitir un diagnóstico, y los politólogos también tienen que ir a las víctimas, conocer los relatos de todos los actores antes de poder emitir su opinión.
And that's something I know that Colombia is very experienced in, because you're in the process of peace building and reconciliation.
Y sé que es algo que en Colombia se sabe muy bien porque están en un proceso de construcción de paz y de reconciliación.
This place, towards the end of the day, the civilian soldier that was taking me around decided he wanted to tell me his story. He ended up moving in this field that you may recognize, which is called the Ream Parking Field, or it's where the music festival occurred into the dawn of October 7th, where more than, I think, 260 people were massacred. And I am there just as they have removed all of the burnt vehicles. This person recovered and retrieved and carried over 200 bodies back to the places where bodies were beginning to be identified and attempted to be returned to family. So we're in this space.
Al final del día, el soldado que me estaba acompañando decidió que quería contarme su historia también, y nos sentamos en este sitio, que es el sitio en donde se estaba dándose el concierto de música que fue el epicentro de los eventos de octubre 7, y el señor me contaba que él tuvo que cargar más de 200 cuerpos hacia el área donde se estaba haciendo la investigación de las
What you
identificaciones.
see around us is the remnants of people's picnics and people's gatherings, and really completely exposed area. There's no shelter. And once again, when I was there, I learned that people had been murdered there. By the time I was arrived, bodies were not there. But months later, I saw evidence of an eyewitness who was hiding in corpses, who saw a woman being gang raped by multiple Hamas commandos.
Lo que ustedes ven ahí como sobras y basura, en realidad son todas las pertenencias que habían llevado para ese día. Y aunque yo no vi los muertos en ese momento, sí tuve la oportunidad de conocer el testimonio de alguien que se había escondido entre los cadáveres, y pudo ver cómo varios jefes de Hamas violaban en masa a una persona inocente.
The woman was a young Israeli music festival goer. She was stripped to her waist. She was handled by her hips from commando to commando to commando, who were Islamist Hamas commandos, as they called themselves.
La asistente, la víctima, era una mujer joven que asistía al concierto, fue desnudada y la pasaron moviéndola por la cadera entre los diferentes militantes de Hamas.
The eyewitness, who was a woman, described what she saw. Even watching her testimony is harrowing.
La otra testigo era otra mujer que, aun cuando escribía lo que decía, el solo escuchar su testimonio era escalofriante.
She describes partway through the gang rape, they pulled the long hair of the woman and arched the neck backwards and arched the torso backwards.
Ella decía que en medio de la violación en grupo le jalaron el pelo hacia atrás y así la obligaron a contorsionarse con el torso hacia atrás.
And one of them took the commando knife and amputated her breasts while she was alive.
Y uno de ellos sacó un cuchillo de comando y le amputó los senos mientras aún estaba viva.
The amputated breasts fell to the ground, and they played with these remnants of her flesh.
Los senos amputados cayeron al suelo y ellos jugaron con estos restantes de su carne.
And that happened in this place.
Y eso sucedió en este lugar.
It was not only Israelis or Jewish people affected, even though Islamist ideology has a cosmic enmity with Judaism and Jewry. It's not really about the state of Israel, it's about the existence of the Jewish people.
No fueron solo israelíes los que fueron víctimas, aunque pues estas personas tienen una enemistad con los israelíes y con el Estado de Israel.
But as you will learn that in anti-Semitism, non-Jews can also be targeted and eliminated in anti-Semitism. And here I'm in the... Sorry.
Pero entenderán que en el antisemitismo también los no judíos pueden ser considerados objetivos.
And here I'm in the home in the desert of a Bedouin lawyer, Mr. Syed Al-Quran, and I'm taking his testimony of how his four Israeli Muslim nephews were murdered by the Hamas missiles that began the attack of October 7th.
Y aquí estoy en el desierto, en la casa de un abogado beduino, quien está dando su testimonio de cómo sus sobrinos fueron asesinados por unos misiles lanzados por Hamas.
There were 19 Muslims that were murdered that day. We think about 1,200 people were murdered that day in total. So it is a small number, but it is distinctly Islamism that is not distinguishing between civilian, adult, male, child, woman, infant. It is absolutely focused on destruction of human beings. This is a very important Israeli Muslim doctor from the Bedouin area. So he's an Israeli citizen. He's a Muslim doctor. He was kept hostage by Hamas on October 7th while he was driving to his hospital.
Entonces, en ese ataque murieron más o menos 19 musulmanes, 1.200 personas en total. Es un número pequeño, pero básicamente muestra cómo en el caso del ataque había una intención meramente destructiva, no era simplemente un tema religioso. Y aquí estamos con un doctor muy conocido, él es árabe y él es israelí, y él fue tomado como rehén.
He was dragged out of his vehicle. His hands were tied, zip-tied behind his back. He was put on his belly, face down, without shoes. His cell phone was taken away.
Entonces lo sacaron arrastrado de su carro, le ataron las manos a la espalda, lo obligaron a acostarse boca abajo en el suelo, le quitaron el celular y los zapatos.
And he was trying to explain to the Hamas, I'm a Muslim, maybe in his naivete that he thought that they would relate to that. Hamas may say they're Muslim, but ideologically they're Islamist. So he was being threatened with execution.
Entonces él intentó decirles que él era musulmán, pero en su ingenuidad él creía que los de Hamas de pronto se iban a tener un poco de conmiseración con él, pero no lo hicieron porque Hamas son, en realidad son islamistas.
He's not a Hamas supporter, he's just a Muslim doctor.
Él no es un simpatizante de Hamas, él simplemente es un doctor musulmán.
And there were 12 Hamas commandos having a debate, and he speaks fluent Arabic, and he heard them say to each other, we now have our human shield.
Entonces él vio que había 12 comandantes de Hamas que estaban discutiendo en árabe, él es árabe, entonces él sabía lo que estaban hablando y él alcanzó a entender que estaban diciendo que, bueno, aquí tenemos nuestro escudo humano.
He wrote those words in Arabic on my notepad. Hamas said, we have our human shield, the Israeli Air Force won't strike us. And they kept him face down for over 3 hours in the middle of the road while they executed every driver and every passenger in 17 cars that came to that intersection.
Entonces él escribió en árabe eso en mi cuaderno, que aquí tenemos un escudo humano, el ejército israelí no se atreverá a bombardearnos mientras él esté con nosotros, y entonces lo dejaron tumbado boca abajo en el suelo por 3 horas mientras masacraban a todos los conductores y pasajeros de al menos 17 carros que estaban en el sector.
Eventually, the commanders were confronted by the Israeli police, and 2 police called to him, "Are you okay?" And Hamas executed them, and then 2 more came and freed him. He was wounded while he was being freed.
Eventualmente tuvieron que enfrentarse a la policía israelí. La policía israelí le preguntó si estaba bien, pero a los policías iniciales los asesinaron y luego vinieron otros policías que sí lo pudieron rescatar.
And actually, maybe this is a good moment to notice that when it comes to Islamism, radical Islam, and we will distinguish it from Islam, the faith, the number 1 victims, lethal and non-lethal injury, are Muslims by the millions. Pakistan alone has lost hundreds of thousands of citizens in its war against Islamists and its war to eliminate Islamists. So this is not that unusual in the scale of our struggles with Islamism, but it may not be very well known in the current conflict that you're following in the Middle East.
Y este es el momento de explicar que en cuestiones del extremismo musulmán, que es diferente de la fe musulmana, la mayor parte de las víctimas son musulmanes. Esto se ve por millones en países como Pakistán. Por ejemplo, hemos tenido esta experiencia en donde la mayor parte de las víctimas, por no decir todas, son musulmanes de su misma fe.
So while I saw the places of the atrocities and listened to the stories of the people who had survived, I was, as a physician, very concerned to see what happened to the dead. And I was also allowed to see these things because of my medical training. So another lesson, first lesson, for the physicians particularly, your role is to bear witness. And the second is that being a physician gives you an extraordinary level of privilege and responsibility outside of your profession, even outside of your country, because human beings will show you anything if you carry the title of doctor, and that could be a soldier, that could be a civilian, that could be someone who doesn't speak your language, because society still has enormous trust in physicians.
Entonces, mientras recogía todos estos testimonios y veía todas estas situaciones, me preocupaba muchísimo qué estaba pasando con los cuerpos y con los muertos. Y aquí viene la segunda lección que les quiero traer, especialmente a los médicos. La primera es, sean testigos, investiguen bien. Y la segunda lección es que cuando uno es médico, todo el mundo se le va a abrir, porque todo el mundo va a tener algo para mostrar, ya sea un civil, un militar, un miliciano. Ellos siempre se van a acercar si tienen algún problema con su salud al médico y se les van a abrir.
So just very briefly, because I'm going to move to some forensic evidence and then close these images and begin our dialogue, this is showing you stretchers on which human beings that had been murdered came to a mass morgue that had to be created within a few hours.
Entonces solamente ya voy a pasar a la evidencia forense, con eso pasamos a la siguiente etapa. Les quiero mostrar esta foto en la que lo que ven ahí son camillas que se utilizaron para crear una morgue masiva que se tuvo que prácticamente construir en cuestión de horas.
In the first 2 weeks, I wasn't there, I was there in the beginning of the third week. The human fluid was coming up to the middle of the shins, so people were wearing protection. And the stretchers were not only used for what you might perceive of as a dead body, which is the size of our living body, but the stretchers were also used for gathered human remains, which we're also going to look at today.
Entonces en ese momento pues las camillas se utilizaron considerando que los fluidos humanos pueden llegar incluso hasta el tobillo. Había que utilizar protección y también había que tener presente que las camillas no solo se utilizaron para trasladar cuerpos humanos enteros, sino también para poder recolectar restos humanos.
Bodies were processed, identification was begun. In this picture, there is a tiny little dot right at the end, which is me. This is 25 refrigerated containers. There I am. So that you can understand the scale of the mass murder, which I am referring to as a genocide driven by Islamist anti-Semitism. And When I was there were about 80 or 90 bodies which still had not been identified, and they would be stored in refrigerated containers.
Entonces aquí estamos hablando de 25 contenedores masivos de refrigeración. Al momento de llegar había más o menos unos 80 o 90 cuerpos que aún no habían sido identificados. Esto yo lo califico como una masacre, un crimen masivo generado por el extremismo radical islámico.
And this picture is showing I was allowed to go inside, but I felt there was no ethical need for me to go inside. But you can see there are 4 levels of bodies, and they are in body bags. And most of the bodies seem a normal size. The blue bag is very truncated because that's just a partial body.
Entonces a mí se me permitía entrar a estos contenedores, pero no vi una razón ética para hacerlo. Todo lo que ustedes ven ahí, las bolsas que ustedes ven ahí son cuerpos, pero la bolsa azul verán que está un poco deforme porque en realidad son cuerpos incompletos.
And this is to show you that I also went to a place when bodies could not be identified. They were taken to the Institute of National Institute of Forensic Medicine, where I then looked at the unidentified remains of human beings. And so the images will become increasingly difficult, and they are maybe not for everybody. So you will shield yourself if it's more difficult, but it's a little warning. Because of my background in medicine, I've had many opportunities where I needed to attend an autopsy or learn about what happened to my patient from the Department of Pathology. So I explained I was able to see materials, and they allowed me to come in, and I'm standing in a wet morgue, actually. The blonde lady next to me has just finished medical school and is in the first 3 months of her pathology internship.
Entonces los cuerpos que no pudieron ser identificados y los restos que no pudieron ser identificados fueron llevados a este instituto. De ahí pude sacar bastantes imágenes que pueden ser un poco difíciles. Es importante que lo sepan por si tienen algún problema con imágenes complicadas. Es bueno que sepan que...
She was certainly not expecting to be looking at an Islamist perpetrated mass murder or genocide in her first few months of learning pathology.
Entonces dice que en su experiencia en el instituto, la mujer que está a toda la derecha, rubia, solo llevaba 3 meses en patología y no estaba esperando que dentro de esa corta experiencia tuviera que pasar por lo que pasó.
In a room nearby, all of these images have been provided to me. These I took, but some images were also provided to me by the Director General of the Center, Dr. Hen Kugel, so exactly for this kind of academic purpose. But I went into a side room where I saw 4 or 5 doctors studying over a very small collection of incinerated human teeth.
Entonces, algunas de estas imágenes las tomé yo, otras me las proporcionaron en el instituto para efectos de investigación, y pude entrar a una sala en la que había 4 o 5 doctores que estaban estudiando restos de dientes humanos incinerados.
And just to orient you, you may see the tooth at the bottom is like a wisdom tooth or a molar. So what's on the right side of the screen would be the surface of the tooth.
Entonces, para orientarlos un poco aquí en el fondo, esa puede ser una muela del juicio o un molar.
These are the roots of teeth.
Ahí están las raíces de los dientes.
And I was astonished, the investigation. These were found in an IDF base that was overrun by Hamas, where there were mostly female soldiers who were, thank you, the female soldiers who were abducted, murdered, mutilated, raped, and ultimately immolated by Hamas. It was mostly females in this base.
Estos restos salieron de una base israelí que fue atacada por Hamas, que tenía mayoritariamente soldados mujeres, que fueron violadas, torturadas, asesinadas y en últimas inmoladas por este grupo.
And the investigation was being led by Dr. Michal Peer, PhD in the thermal injury of dentition, Because people have car accidents and the car may catch fire and you have to know who was driving, and there is an entire field of study dedicated to this.
El estudio fue dirigido por el doctor Michael PhD en identificación moral, porque ya hay todo un campo de estudio que está dedicado a este tipo de cosas.
And I'm going to move on. This is a vertebral body. The vertebral body and the teeth, they have been subject to thermobaric incineration at temperatures of around 2700 Celsius.
Este es un cuerpo que junto con los dientes fue sometido a incineración termobárica que se hace a los 220 grados Celsius.
All we could tell with the professor of pathology is that there's a very continuous rim here, which seems quite intact. This is a bone in the spinal column. That tells us that this person was not younger than 16 and not older than 40. After 40, we see osteoarthritis. Below 16, we don't see that lip.
Todo lo que podemos ver, todo lo que esto nos permitió identificar es que la persona no era mayor de 16 años y menor de 40 por los bordes y por la composición.
And recently, the United Nations came with an envoy to Israel to investigate sexual violence. Was it systematic? Did it occur, etc.? And they said it did occur, and we can't be convinced it was systematically part of the ideology. I would contest that based on the bodies that were described, the evidence I gathered, but also because this also was found in the same base, also populated by mostly females, because the Israeli military has found that females are very good at looking at radars and multitasking, much better than male soldiers. So these are the remains of women that encountered Hamas, that came with a nihilistic intention towards them on that day.
Y un enviado de la ONU lo envió a una persona para determinar si estos actos eran sistemáticos, y mi opinión es que sí. Son sistemáticos. En esta base había más que todo mujeres, porque los soldados israelíes prefieren a las mujeres ya que pueden ver mejoras en el multitasking, muchas tareas mejores que los hombres, y por eso las tenían ahí, y jamás igual entró con una intención nihilística de eliminarlas.
And I'm conscious of the time because I know we're going to have a long discussion. I just am going to warn you that we're coming to the most difficult images that most professionals find difficult to witness, so either watch or shield your gaze. The complaint the United Nations made is nobody came forward. We were there for a long time. We didn't find a single witness to tell us that she had experienced sexual violence. Since then, there have been some hostages, and that is because many remains came in this condition.
Nadie, primero que todo, pues ya vamos a pasar a las imágenes difíciles, entonces si alguien tiene algún problema con las imágenes, por favor, no las mire. Ahora, la crítica que hacía las Naciones Unidas principalmente es que nadie habló, nadie atestiguó, las mujeres no dijeron que habían sido violadas, pero eso es porque la mayoría de las víctimas terminaban en esta condición.
These are what they are termed charred remains or incinerated remains, and even as a fairly seasoned physician, I thought that I was looking at some kind of rib cage. I didn't know what this was, and if we look at it at a different angle, and I also correlated this with interviews that I took of morgue workers who said they were carrying body bags that seemed way heavier than normal, but not as big as an adult, so that was very perplexing. And so they examined these remains in high-resolution CT imaging.
Estos son restos incinerados. Yo realmente no pude decir exactamente a qué parte del cuerpo correspondían. Creí que se trataba de costillas. Gente que participó en eso testificaba que a veces tenían que cargar restos que no parecían ser de un adulto, entonces todo era tremendamente confuso, así que tuvieron que utilizar técnicas de rayos X y de imagenología para determinar.
I want to show you current. Can you see the date? 12th of October. So this remain arrived 5 days after the attack. What you see here is a spinal column, but you also see another spinal column. Human beings only have one spinal column. Also, you see this is arching one way, and this is arching another way.
Entonces, pues si se fijan en la fecha, esto es del 12 de octubre, 5 días después del ataque, y lo que vemos aquí es una columna vertebral por un lado y otra columna vertebral por el otro. Están arqueadas de manera diferente y los seres humanos solo tienen una columna vertebral.
You also see something, there are definitely ribs, so my instinct was correct that I was seeing some ribs. But you see this, which is not anatomical. You see this is a carefully constructed knot.
Entonces ustedes aquí pueden ver costillas, que en eso tal vez acerté, pero esto de acá y lo de abajo no son anatómicos. Eso fue construido.
A slightly different view of the same image, you can see this was two people that were bound together before they were immolated.
Aquí vieron, aquí hay una imagen de lo mismo desde otro ángulo. Pudimos concluir que fueron dos personas que fueron prácticamente atadas juntas antes de ser inmoladas.
This looks like a part of the cervical spine, so this may have been the neck of one of them.
Esto parece ser parte de la nuca de una persona.
I met many workers who described, and one testified with me carrying the body bags, he could feel the charcoal crumbling in his fingers. It was very agonizing for him because he was a religious worker and would have to open bags that would contain remains like this.
Tuve que ver los testimonios de varios trabajadores que decían que sentían que el carbón se desintegraba en sus dedos, y ellos eran trabajadores muy religiosos y por eso esto era muy difícil para ellos, y sobre todo abrir las bolsas y ver restos como estos.
And this is similar. This, the pathologist pointed out, this indicates fatal injury. This is a skull. And if you go to Rwanda, which has a very important history where they survived a genocide about 25 plus years ago, this is very indicative of attacks that occur in genocide with violence.
Esto patológicamente implica una herida mortal. Si ustedes pues miran el caso de Rwanda, que fue un genocidio muy importante que pasó hace 25 años, verán que esto era indicativo de crímenes masivos relacionados con violencia.
And sometimes remains came like this, which would, I don't know how the rescuers clearing up the scene could even gather this. I don't know how they knew to gather this, which looks like compost.
Y muchas veces los restos venían así. Yo no sé cómo hacían los recolectores para recolectar esos restos y poderlos unir. Parece compost.
I don't mean to be disrespectful to any victim of violence, but I don't know how else to describe it. So this material would be placed on the CT scanner and you see that it was human material. This was a human being. This is a long bone. This looks like maybe a piece of skull. This is another bone. I don't know if that's part of the shoulder blade.
Entonces no quisiera ser irrespetuoso con las víctimas, pero no sé de qué otra manera ponerlo. Lo pasamos por la imagenología y nos dimos cuenta que esto era un ser humano. Acá hay un hueso, otro hueso, parte de un omoplato.
And we're getting to the final images, which I'll show you very briefly. And again, remind you, you have this resource now in Bogota, which with proper permissions, you can access all of this information.
Vamos a las imágenes finales que les voy a mostrar muy rápidamente. No sin antes recordarle que tienen acceso a esto desde Bogotá con los permisos adecuados.
This is also gathered in the Pathology Forensic Center. You can see that these are zip ties and these are cords.
Esto también lo pueden encontrar en el Centro de Patología Forense y pueden ver que ahí hay básicamente zip ties y nudos de cuerdas.
The Hamas commandos came equipped with many zip ties.
Los comandantes de Hamas vinieron equipados con muchos zip ties.
And so we saw them on the wrists of bodies that were recovered. This is a body that's in advanced decay.
Los vimos en los cuerpos de muchos cuerpos que recuperamos. Este es un cuerpo que está avanzado de decadencia.
It's also been burned.
También ha sido quemado.
So people were restrained before they were being executed, but executed is too sanitized a word for what actually these people lived through.
Entonces a la gente la inmovilizaban. Se puede ver que la inmovilizaban antes de ejecutarla, pero ejecutar es una palabra demasiado misericordiosa para lo que pasaron estas personas.
Very horrifically, people were restrained with electrical cord from electrical appliances. I have clearer picture for you. You can see this is the head of an electrical plug.
De manera horrorosa la gente fue inmovilizada con cables eléctricos y con aparatos eléctricos. Aquí pueden ver que esto hace parte de un enchufe eléctrico.
Many people, including Jewish commentators and American reporters, were describing the events of October 7th as a pogrom, which you will know about in political science. But a pogrom implies a crowd suddenly becomes frenzied and executes a minority group, or usually pogroms are used, as far as I know, in the context of Jewish pogroms. But this was all premeditated, and this just shows they utilized their zip ties and they found whatever they could, but it was not a frenzy. It was a systematic and planned approach.
Muchos comentaristas judíos y periodistas norteamericanos trataron el hecho como un pogromo. Un pogromo, pues para los que son de ciencia política saben que es un evento de violencia extrema contra una minoría. Solo que en este caso también se nota que fue algo que estuvo planificado.
This body, you can tell, was tied behind their back before they lost their life. And there are many such images, but I'm going to talk to you about one body that I examined myself.
En este cuerpo, pues ustedes pueden ver que fue inmovilizado antes de perder su vida. Pues hay muchas imágenes, pero quiero hablarles de una que yo examiné yo misma.
And this was a man. You can see that he was tied at the wrists.
Este es un hombre, pueden ver que estaba amarrado de las muñecas.
When I examined his body, he was stabbed. He was shot in multiple places, both types of injuries.
Cuando examiné su cuerpo vi que había sido acuchillado y le habían disparado en múltiples lugares.
I didn't take a close-up of his legs, but his legs, when we lifted them up from knee to ankle, sagged like a ribbon because the legs were macerated.
No tomé una foto de las piernas, pero cuando levantamos las piernas nos dimos cuenta de que estaban prácticamente destrozadas.
And we saw he, as I wrote about him, I think in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, death came as a surprise. He's wearing his T-shirt and he's wearing his Java headphone accessory, the cell phone accessory. This was a human being, a person in full thrust of their life.
Y para él, como lo escribí en un periódico norteamericano, la muerte vino como una sorpresa. Él tenía todavía sus audífonos, tenía su camiseta y era una persona humana en el mejor de su vida.
Briefly, there were evidence of defensive wounds, many hand injuries. Victims are zip-tied, trying to cover themselves from the horror, not able to fight back.
Había evidencia de heridas defensivas de gente que intentó defenderse con sus manos, pero pues no pudo.
I took verbal testimony that I recorded of evisceration.
Hay testimonios verbales que registré de evisceraciones.
This is evisceration. There is no medical or surgical indication for evisceration. That is just destructive annihilation, dehumanization of another human being.
Esto es una evisceración, no, realmente no hay una indicación médica de evisceración, solamente es la intención nihilística de destruir a otro ser humano.
And I'm almost at the end because I've taken up an hour when it was supposed to be 15 minutes. I apologize. You can see on this body stabbings on the skull. You can see the body is also charred and the body was eviscerated. So multiple forms of violence and execution. It was not enough to just shoot the person and move on. There was this extraordinary nihilism in the hatred, and that came from the Islamist ideology. That is where this comes from.
Quiero pedir excusas porque me tomé una hora cuando me había tomado 15 minutos, pero en este último cuerpo ustedes pueden ver que además de la evisceración hubo múltiples puñaladas y disparos. No fue suficiente con matarlo, había que hacerle realmente daño, y eso es una muestra del odio que la ideología islámica
Islamist, a big difference, not Islamic. Islamist, radical Islam. The United Nations said no victims came forward. Nobody said I was gang raped, I was mutilated. Here is the remains of a 25-year-old woman. You can see these are her teeth, the brain is exposed, and she was burned. How can she tell you what happened to her before she reached this end? And the civilians that survived said there were hours in which they were at the subject to Hamas before there was any help that arrived.
Aquí podemos ver los restos de una mujer de 25 años que fue quemada y hubo testimonios de gente que estuvo hasta 10 horas siendo retenida por Hamas antes de que pudieran recibir ayuda.
Again, immolation, I can see the liver. This is a torso. Remember the body bags that were short. So this person went through other trauma before their remains were incinerated. And in fact, the pathologist found even soot in the airway, which told them people were alive while they were being burned.
Aquí podemos ver muestras de otros traumas que sufrieron estas víctimas antes de ser incineradas y los patólogos incluso encontraron evidencia que mostraba que esta gente estaba viva incluso antes de ser quemada.
And finally, this is a very important point. It's a grotesque image. This was a human being. This was, let's just look at my notes, 62-year-old man who was shot in the head in front of his children. His relatives were also abducted, and then the head has been decapitated. And why this is important is this practice of decapitation, which we began to see with ISIS and has been perpetuated here. Extremist groups cross-pollinate from one another. And extremist Islamist groups have very much gained insight from certain extremist cartel movements that do a lot of decapitation. And we learned that at counterterrorism meetings pre-pandemic, that there is this practice. So there is no end of their refining of their cruelty.
Aquí tenemos una imagen grotesca, es un señor de 65 años, le dispararon en la casa frente de su familia y después lo decapitaron. Nos hemos enterado desde incluso antes de la pandemia que estos grupos terroristas interactúan entre sí mismos, intercambian experiencias entre sí mismos y por eso la decapitación es una práctica muy común en este tipo de organizaciones.
The last image, and I commend you for watching and listening with such respect, is a woman. She's a grandmother. Elderly woman with a hearing aid, and she was murdered with her grandchild who was autistic. Actually, the grandchild was a little girl, and these are the toys of the little girl. So indiscriminate murder. Islam prohibits murder of anybody who's in conflict, of anybody who's not an armed soldier. So this is a complete departure, but there was ample evidence.
Esta es la última imagen y quiero agradecerles y felicitarlos por haber mirado esto con tanto respeto. Esta es la imagen de una abuela de 65 años y su nieta que era autista. Ellas fueron asesinadas y arriba pueden ver los juguetes de la niña. La fe del Islam prohíbe asesinar a gente que no está armada y que no es un combatiente y por eso esto se aleja completamente de esas creencias.
We can put the lights on. No more images.
Ya podemos prender la luz y acabaron las imágenes.
Yes, it's hard to know. I don't think we need to that. Thank you.
Bueno, dado esta sección maravillosa en un solo evento que hace que médicos y politólogos nos encontremos, pues vamos a hacer preguntas desde ambos ámbitos que la doctora nos pueda, digamos, iluminar. Yo quisiera arrancar con una, lo voy a hacer inmediatamente en inglés. As you know, Dr. Qanta, and because of our historical background as a Spanish colony in the past, most Latin American countries are Christian Catholic. So it's quite strange for all of us to talk about Islam, which is quite a strange religion in the continent and of course in Latin America in general. So I would like you to give us some like very clear ideas about what's the difference between being Muslim and Islamist. And if it is fair to say that Islamist is a synonym of radical Islam or terrorist. Thank you.
So, really great question. Thank you. First of all, thank you for this ability to show some extremely painful human suffering. Islam is a monotheistic religion. A follower of Islam has to subscribe that there is one God and Muhammad is his messenger. But a Muslim that believes Islam has to accept Christianity and Jesus and the Virgin Mary and the Torah and Moses. So Islam is by its origin pluralistic theologically.
Entonces el Islam es una religión, bueno, empezó por la pregunta, pues si no la entendieron, la pregunta es, los países latinoamericanos y en Colombia somos más que todo cristianos, católicos, entonces no entendemos muy bien esta religión del Islam que nos parece extraña, entonces ¿cuál sería la diferencia entre el islamista, si podemos utilizar esa palabra, y el Islam, el musulmán? Y lo que la doctora está diciendo es que el Islam es una religión monoteísta que como religión entiende y acepta la existencia de Moisés, de Jesús, de la Virgen. Es una religión pluralista por definición.
Now, you've asked a question that many scholars of this area struggle to answer, is what is the difference between a Muslim and Islamist? So Islamism is also called radical Islam. It's the same word.
Entonces, la pregunta es una pregunta que muchos académicos han intentado responder, ¿cuál es la diferencia entre un musulmán y un islamista? Pues islamista viene de la palabra del Islam, que básicamente es la misma palabra.
Islamism is a political totalitarian ideology that originated in 1928, as opposed to Islam that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century.
Entonces el islamismo es una ideología político-totalitaria que fue creada en 1928 en contraposición a la religión del Islam que fue creada por Mahoma.
Islamists take the language and the metaphor and the images of Islam and state the foundational tenet is that Islam can only be experienced as statehood, which is absolutely not mentioned in the Quran. They use an Arabic word, dola, which means statehood. ISIS called it caliphate. They believe that that's the only manifestation which Islam can exist, is a statehood that has totalitarian control over the self. And that is not the truth about Islam. It's okay.
Statehood. Sí, es que es totalitarismo. Sí, entonces el islamismo lo que propone es una palabra básica que básicamente podemos llamarlo totalitarismo en español, en donde pues que eso no existe en el Islam, en la religión del Islam como tal. I think that's it.
I think that's it. I think you're trying to say, yeah. Also, there are other tenets in Islamism. They are obsessed with purity and authenticity and rejection of whatever they decide is not pure and authentic. So they are very rigid. They have particular beliefs about dress and conduct, and a lot of that results in misogyny against women and girls.
Y otro de los principios básicos que tiene el islamismo es una rigidez con respecto a los conceptos de pureza, y ellos no aceptan algo que no sea puro, y eso es lo que ha resultado en todo este rechazo y toda esta misoginia y toda esta violencia hacia las mujeres.
However, central to Islamism is a cosmic, not a mortal, a cosmic, relentless enmity against what they conceive of as Jewry, as Judaism, as the Jewish person, as the Jewish state. Anything that they decide that represents that is legitimate for elimination and is part of their mission.
Y el islamismo profesa una enemistad cósmica casi que inagotable hacia todo lo que tenga que ver con judaísmo, el Estado judío, la religión judía, la raza judía, y básicamente no descansará hasta ver la eliminación de este enemigo.
And there's probably some context that you're better educated on than I am, which is that this came from dissidents that were imprisoned in 1928 Egypt. Their ambition was the goal of pan-Arabism, kind of like Jamal Nasser. But when that was humiliated and failed, these ideologues became even more fanatical in their opposition. So there is some very contemporary relationship that's crystallized their beliefs. This is not a movement in 1928. There was not even a Jewish state. This is an ideology that they've distilled, and because it contains the language and metaphors of Islam, it's extremely dangerous, because many adherents to this political ideology believe it's a religion and have religionized the political ideology as a creed. I'm sorry that's such a long paragraph.
Entonces, esto nació un movimiento que nace en algunos ideólogos que estaban en Egipto encarcelados en 1928. Esto es una religión, digamos, este movimiento fracasó, y en la medida en que fracasó, pues se radicalizaron aún más. Y ahora, hoy en día, pues representan un peligro porque ellos utilizan mucho el lenguaje de la religión y mezclan esta ideología totalitaria con el tema religioso, lo cual los hace tremendamente peligrosos.
A couple of areas for the political science students to study is look at what happened to the state of Egypt after the arrival of President Mohamed Morsi. He was a Muslim Brotherhood hardliner, and he came into political power at some point after the initiation of the Arab Spring. And by the time he had started to implement his totalitarian ambitions, which included installing Sharia courts above the Supreme Court of Egypt, 93 million mostly Muslim Egyptians came on the streets to overthrow him.
Y aquí hay un ejemplo para los estudiantes de ciencia política para que lo estudien con relación a este tema, y es el tema de Mohamed Morsi cuando subió a la presidencia de Egipto. Él subió a la presidencia de Egipto un poco después de la primavera árabe, y él era parte del ala radical de la hermandad árabe, y cuando intenta implementar estas medidas radicales en Egipto, millones de musulmanes salieron a las calles para destituirlo.
And other examples of totalitarianism which are totally antithetical to Islam, if we think about the Taliban in Afghanistan, which takes actually, I can sit down later and give you a list of books that you might want to recommend your students to look at. They revive a fictional version of a Sharia. These are man-made, invented Sharias, which they impose their form of brutal justice, which just this month, I think the Taliban has announced we're bringing back stoning of women. It's not enough to just prevent them from going to school. We're going to stone them. And they claim to exercise Islamic justice. They take an extremely literal view from texts that probably are not correctly interpreted. And they practice justice in the absence of mercy, which is a violation of Islam. There is no justice if there is no mercy. And so this is another example.
Y otro ejemplo que valdría la pena mencionar es el de los talibanes en Afganistán. Hay muchos libros que se pueden leer en ese respecto. Ellos inventaron una sharia, hay muchas sharias inventadas, y ellos inventaron una en la cual imponían esta concepción brutal de justicia, en la cual técnicamente para que hubiera justicia no tenía que dar misericordia, y eso no es así.
And the last thing that's coming to my mind is, of course, you will have studied, and everybody here will know about the genocide that ISIS perpetuated on the Yazidi women. Also, during the ISIS genocide of Yazidi women and the ISIS caliphate, they terrorized and persecuted and murdered Christians, forced Christians to convert, labeled Christians' homes with the Nun. And I have visited the desecrated churches of the Christians in Iraq. And interestingly, they would target the statues of the Virgin Mary and decapitate the statues of the Virgin Mary, which I have also seen. So their objection to the Yazidi was, they said the Yazidi was a devil worshipper, even though they are some of the original monotheists. And their objection to the Christian was that the Christian was an infidel and not pure and not authentic and needed to be eliminated. That, all those people that were in ISIS, they were considering themselves Muslim. they were using the language of the Quran, but actually they were violating every principle of Islam that was ever brought to us.
Y el otro ejemplo que vale la pena considerar es la masacre que los miembros de ISIS cometieron sobre los yazidíes, a quienes eran adoradores del demonio, y pues estas personas iban y decapitaban las estatuas de la Virgen María, y básicamente consideraban un enemigo no solo sino también a los que...
Yes, yes.
Bueno, voy a hacer una pequeña introducción para que se entienda. Yo soy psiquiatra, trabajo, la primera contacto con temas masivos de muerte tuvo que ver en el año 85 con el desastre de Armero, donde murió mucha gente por un desastre natural.
Actual disaster. Yes,
So
please.
he's a psychiatrist. He's a psychiatrist, and he works with topics of massive death. And he had to experience. His first experience was in the year 1985, with the tragedy of Armero, which was a volcano here that exploded.
En el mismo mes se presentó un hecho violento, pero producido por humanos, que fue la toma del Palacio de Justicia.
And in that same month, there was another
Por un grupo
violent
guerrillero.
act that was produced by humans. That was the taking of the Palace of Justice, which is where the president
Oh,
resides.
yes, I heard about that today.
En este momento aún conocemos y estamos investigando en términos forenses, buscando identificar cuerpos que se rescataron del Palacio de Justicia.
Even today, we're still looking for corpses and trying to identify the corpses that were rescued from that time.
Wow,
Mi esposa es patóloga forense.
I see.
Ella trabajó hasta septiembre del año pasado, se pensionó y dijo no más con eso.
My wife is a forensic pathologist.
Wow.
She worked until September last year, then she retired and said, I don't want any more of this.
Oh, gosh.
Entonces, ahora voy con la pregunta, ¿sí?
He collaborates, yes.
Todas las tardes mi esposa y yo conversábamos y ella me mostraba imágenes o me describía imágenes, olores, tacto, de cuerpos putrefactos. Y yo en cambio le contaba, hoy hablé con alguien que torturaron o que sigue buscando sus hijas sabiendo que abusaron sexualmente de ellas y las está buscando en fosas comunes y lleva 5 años en eso. O sea que mis formas de narrarle el sufrimiento eran sonoras o corporales, y si yo sentía algo aquí feo, ¿cierto? Estoy tratando de invitar a la doctora a que hablemos de los sentidos.
So the question is, he used to discuss with his wife every afternoon, and she described him about the rotten corpses, what she saw, and he described him about the suffering of people who had their daughters raped and who were looking for them. And he usually used more like the senses, like the touches and the smells and the sounds. So he wanted to talk about senses, the senses in this context.
Entonces, yo he participado en peritajes forenses para documentar daño, pero daño psicosocial, donde ha pasado 20 años, 8 años de ocurridos, por ejemplo, una violencia sexual, decapitaciones, cuerpos desaparecidos. Y por otro lado he trabajado, y me interesa mucho en los últimos 20 años trabajar es en la terapia, en la sanación del sufrimiento de estas personas que han sobrevivido. Mi señora tenía que ver a documentar el daño y lo más objetivamente posible, dejar el registro fotográfico, etcétera. Y hay otra intención, y es el de en ciencias políticas, supongo, es por ejemplo Unión Patriótica, es un movimiento político que fue exterminado, se habla de un genocidio en este caso. Entonces hay unos intereses particulares de documentar el daño ahí. Por otro está el interés periodístico. La doctora, ¿cómo cambia el chip cuando tiene que hacer un relato entre Fox News o cuando tiene que documentar ante Naciones Unidas, o si está en terapia, digamos, atendiendo pacientes? ¿Qué dimensión sale ahí de su ser?
So basically, the question is that he had this experience of working in forensic reports where he had to register the damage, the psychological damages, while his wife had to register all the body damages and all the suffering in the
Yes.
body. So he wants to know, how is it possible to change the mindset when you're dealing with the same problem from a journalistic point of view, and when you're doing it like from a more scientific or medical point of view?
As a matter of fact, and I think this comes back to your students, you have students of medicine and students of politics, is one of the incredible privileges of practicing medicine. It doesn't matter what you practice. It doesn't matter if you're the most accomplished professor or you are an ordinary local doctor without lots of accolades. You are presented with human beings. I see 25 patients a day, every day, for 34 years. So there is a great exposure to humanity, which if you're a good doctor, you're going to listen and learn from your patients. I think that has given me an ability to listen and absorb a lot of information. My book is dedicated to my parents in the Land of Invisible Women and my psychotherapist. So I worked with a psychotherapist for 25 years because even before any of this, I'm dealing with people that are critically ill, people that have major devastating events, bereavements. So I think a healthy doctor has their own psychotherapist with whom they can also reflect. One other aspect, and then I'll come to your question about how to change. Many of my patients for the last 15 years have been survivors of September 11th. Just like you went to the scene after a volcano or after the storming and military coup that happened in a palace, I have patients. Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting about the translation. Sorry.
Pues básicamente, pues eran dos ideas. La primera idea es que pues uno de los grandes beneficios que tienen los médicos es que lidian y tratan con personas todos los días, entonces es muy importante aprender de ellos, escucharlos y saber escuchar. Pero el segundo tema que es muy importante cuando se trata con estos medios es tener un psicoterapeuta. Ya he trabajado con su psicoterapeuta durante los últimos 20 años y este trabajo le ha ayudado mucho para poder hacer lo que hace. Ella pues tiene escrito este libro que precisamente le dedicó a sus padres y a su psicoterapeuta por la importancia que pues este psicoterapeuta tiene.
The patients that I look after were survivors of Ground Zero, which took years to clean, of incinerated materials, and they have a lot of diseases from doing that. So sometimes I'm their medical doctor, but they will tell me about their memories, or they will tell me about their dreams, or they will tell me about their recurring nightmares that are related to the content of the terrorist acts.
Entonces ella ha tenido que trabajar muchos años con los sobrevivientes del 9/11, así como pues él tuvo que trabajar con los sobrevivientes de la toma de Palacio. Y lo que dice es que aunque los tuvo que tratar médicamente, muchas veces ellos le contaban sus miedos, sus sueños, las pesadillas que tenían, los problemas, digamos, emocionales que estaban sintiendo.
Now for the big question, how do we ever stop this from happening? I think that there is always going to be violence of this nature if we separate it from the politics, because man is capable of extraordinary violence as much as man meaning mankind, as much as humankind is able to achieve remarkable acts of compassion and altruism. So I don't think that we will ever live in humanity liberated of all violence. I do think that the way to mitigate and prevent these violences begins with speech and language. The only way these acts occurred, or the only way Al-Qaeda eliminated 2,900 Americans, or the only way ISIS destroyed thousands of the Yazidi community, which continues to experience a genocide because they're supposed to marry each other, is by beginning to speak and challenge ideologies that have the intention of dehumanization and delegitimization of any peoples.
Entonces la gran pregunta es si podemos acabar con este tipo de violencia. La respuesta es que no. Aún así la separáramos de lo político. El ser humano es capaz de un gran grado, un gran nivel de maldad y de daño, pero todo esto inicia con el habla y con el lenguaje. Entonces, si desde el habla y el lenguaje pudiéramos acabar, digamos, con el discurso que tienen personas como ISIS o como Al-Qaeda, que acaban con los yazidíes o que acabaron con 2.900 norteamericanos, probablemente podemos estar dando un gran paso hacia reducir este tipo de violencias.
And it's not just a discourse for the sake of vanity to say that we're speaking about it. It's actually mastery of language and not yielding control of language and control of narrative to movements that have a totalitarian ambition. I'm not speaking about left-wing politics or right-wing politics. I'm speaking about Islamism specifically that likes to exploit the space in secular pluralistic democracies, which I agree is the best known construct for societies to live in, and uses that space masquerading as I'm a religious minority. Let's say I'm an Islamist, I'm a Muslim. I'm not announcing myself as an Islamist. I need minority rights. I need a place to pray. I need a time to pray. I need political representation. All of those things are legal and allowed and welcomed in a democracy. What is absolutely inappropriate is encroaching domination over the public space, over ideas, over marginalization of other ideas until a democratic society can be silenced. And we're seeing that happen in our universities already.
Entonces el tema es un tema de dominio, de maestría del lenguaje para acabar con estos discursos, porque está pasando que en las sociedades democráticas muchas veces estos discursos se disfrazan bajo pues la apariencia de las minorías religiosas, de los derechos que yo tengo como minorías religiosas, de mi derecho a rezar, de que soy parte del Islam y el Islam no es una religión mayoritaria, pero después se terminan volviendo se terminan utilizando estos espacios para convertirlos en espacios de dominación, espacios de autoritarismo, espacios de abusos, y eso lo estamos viendo mucho en las sociedades democráticas actualmente.
I think that there's a very interesting legal decision that was announced, I think very early this morning or late last night. It was in the BBC News. You may have seen it.
Creo que una decisión legal muy interesante que fue anunciada tal vez esta mañana en la BBC, tal vez ya la vieron.
And this,
About praying. Was
Yes.
that the same news? Okay.
would you
Go
want to
ahead, go ahead.
explain it to your students in Spanish? Yeah, why not?
Bueno, fue una noticia de esta mañana, hubo una discusión en Inglaterra porque una profesora de una escuela pública comenzó a rezar en las mismas instalaciones, y pues la mayoría, pues es obviamente una minoría. Ella se sintió discriminada por las críticas que le vinieron de las directivas. La cosa escaló hasta las cortes, y justamente hoy en la mañana el magistrado lo que acaba de legislar es que pues no está bien que lo haga en público, y mucho menos en un espacio de una escuela pública donde eso va también en contravía a lo que sería un poco el espíritu cívico de lo público. Entonces es como un ejemplo justamente de lo que está pasando, de que estas personas vienen ganando y quieren ganar de una forma equivocada espacios, apelando a su condición de minoría, pero en realidad terminan generando una violencia mayor, si se quiere, o interrumpiendo por lo menos el espíritu de lo que debe ser la libertad general y las libertades generales de todos y no de unos pocos. If you don't mind, I would like to move to politics again.
Okay, yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for your answer.
Yes.
In a quite recent talk that took place at the Technion, Israel's Institute of Technology, was late October 2023, a few weeks after the massacre. You told the audience about your experience in Pakistan with children that were abducted by Taliban in order to radicalize them.
Yes.
In that context, what did you learn about the idea of woman that those jihadist groups create apparently from the Quran? I mean, the key question is how far is that concept, that jihadist concept of woman, from real Islam?
So, oh yes, the translation.
I can translate. I can do it in Spanish.
Okay.
Estuvo en octubre del año pasado en un instituto de tecnología en Israel, unas semanas después de la masacre del 7 de octubre. Y ella le contaba a la audiencia de su experiencia en Pakistán con niños que habían sido secuestrados por los talibanes para ser radicalizados y convertidos en terroristas. En ese contexto, mi pregunta es, ¿qué aprendió ella del concepto de mujer que tienen estos grupos yihadistas y terroristas? Digamos, para ser más precisos, ¿qué tan lejos está ese concepto yihadista de la mujer del verdadero Islam?
So that's really an interesting question, and I've also asked this for the political science students. The best author on Islamism in terms of a political science text is Bassam Tibi, Bassam Tibi. He is of Syrian origin and a German national now, and a Muslim, and so he describes all of the ideology in great detail. What I saw in Pakistan, which was in the Swat Valley, I was there a few weeks before Malala Yousafzai was shot in the head by the Taliban because she was writing blogs for the BBC. If you want to translate that.
Entonces, primero para los estudiantes de ciencia política, pues el autor más importante del islamismo ya actualmente es Masum. Can you repeat the name?
Malala
No,
Yousafzai.
the author.
Bassam
Bassam Tibi. Es Bassam Tibi. Pues para los que quieran estudiar más sobre ese tema. Ella estuvo trabajando en Pakistán precisamente un poco antes de que a Malala Yousaf le dispararan por andar publicando cosas para la BBC.
So one of the questions I asked is, where can I read about the Islamist principles on women? And the Islamists are so misogynistic, there is almost no writing about the position of women because they don't enter into the equation. Then I'll get back to your answer.
Y estuve preguntando cuáles son los principios islámicos con respecto a la mujer, pero la religión es tan misógina que realmente hay muy poco escrito con relación al tema.
But to describe to you the children that I saw in Pakistan, they were from poor families. They were preyed upon by the Taliban recruiters. So they knew the family who was poor, and they said, either you give us a child or you give us a big ransom, which is unaffordable for the family.
Entonces, trabajando con los niños en Pakistán, pues pude ver que eran niños que pertenecían a familias muy poco privilegiadas. Estos niños eran perseguidos por Al-Qaeda y cuando los raptaban les decían a las familias o me dan dinero, tienen que darme dinero si quieren volver a ver a sus hijos, pero estos eran sumas que obviamente estas familias no podían pagar.
And usually the parents would say, well, you can't take my eldest because he's making a little bit of money for the family. And you can't take my youngest because that's my baby. So the children that were abducted are usually middle boys that would be handed over to the Taliban because they couldn't afford the ransom.
Y al final lo que los padres hacían era negociar con el talibán el secuestro y entonces les decían no pueden llevarse a mi hijo mayor porque él está trayendo un poco de ingresos a la familia, pero tampoco pueden llevarse a mi hijo menor porque él es mi bebé. Entonces lo que terminaban haciendo era negociando la entrega de los hijos del medio.
And they might be 10 or 12 years of age. And that was probably going back to Pakistan, I'd say close to 16, 17 years ago that I was there, and then maybe in the last decade.
Y estos niños tenían entre 10 y 12 años. Esto fue cuando yo estaba en Pakistán, más o menos hace unos 10, 12 años atrás, en la última década.
By the time that I had started to meet the former child soldiers of ISIS, these boys were much younger. They were in the age of 6 and above.
Por el momento en que conocí a los jóvenes combatientes de ISIS, me di cuenta que estos niños eran incluso menores, tenían de 6 años e incluso un poco más.
Before I forget, there are probably two very important psychologists that you should invite to your university that work in de-radicalization and rehabilitation of victims of jihadism.
Antes de que se me olvide, hay dos psicólogos muy importantes que pienso que deberían invitar a su universidad. Ellos trabajan con la desradicalización de los combatientes del yihadismo.
One is the Pakistani neuropsychologist Dr. Fariha Paracha, who built the de-radicalization program and school in Pakistan with the Pakistani military.
Uno de ellos es el doctor pakistani Paracha, que fue quien construyó el programa de desradicalización de los militantes yihadistas en Pakistán con los militares.
She brought me there. She presented for the first time to NATO the features of the jihadist boys, who they were and how they ended up in their path.
Ella fue la primera que presentó ante la OTAN el perfil de los niños radicalizados yihadistas, cómo eran y cuál era su perfil.
You're asking about the place of women in their ideology. Her remark to me is these boys were marked by a profound absence of contact with femininity anywhere in their development and in their pathway. So it's not necessarily what is the jihadist and Islamist planning concerning women. The women are already vanished in their construct. It is that they also lack the normal formative influence of womanhood, motherhood, siblings, and therefore you see the young jihadists also treating women as sexual objects and objects for sexual violence later on. So she's an authority on that.
Tú me estabas preguntando sobre el tema de la mujer y eso me acuerda un comentario que ella hizo ante la OTAN y es que estos niños crecen sin ningún tipo de contacto con la feminidad, sin ningún tipo de contacto con ninguna mujer. Entonces el problema es que de por sí ya la mujer no existe en estas organizaciones y al final las terminan viendo básicamente como un objeto sexual o como algo menos de un ser humano.
And the other psychologist you should invite here is extraordinary, both of them are extraordinary, Dr. Jan Kazilhan, who is in Strasbourg in Germany.
Y el otro psicólogo que querían invitar, que es extraordinaria, es la doctora Jan Kazilhan, que estaba en Alemania.
He's a psychiatrist and psychologist like our colleague Dr. Rodriguez. And he was also watching, and he's also of Yazidi origin.
Él es un psicólogo y un psiquiatra como el doctor Rodríguez y él también es de origen yazidi.
And he was watching the beginning of the Yazidi genocide, and Yazidis in Iraq were writing to him, ISIS is coming step by step and committing genocide on us.
Y él tuvo que presenciar el origen de la masacre yazidi en Irak y los yazidíes le escribían y le decían, ISIS ya viene y le describían paso por paso qué era lo que estaba pasando.
And so for the medical students, the first thing he did is write an article in the local tabloid newspaper to raise awareness, not in some fancy paper. He wrote in the paper he could get published in that was read by the most people. And within a few days, he had secured millions of euros to go and try and salvage Yazidi lives.
Entonces, para los estudiantes de medicina, lo primero que hizo fue publicar en el diario local. No lo hizo en el diario más importante que encontró, sino en el primero en el que pudo publicar. Y al cabo de unos pocos días pudo, gracias a eso, recaudar millones de dólares que le permitieran ir y viajar a tratar de salvar lo que se podía en el caso de la masacre yazidi.
During the first days of the war, he went to Iraq while ISIS was on their mission of committing genocide and while the war was active, and he was tasked with bringing back people that he could salvage to Germany, and he brought 1,100 Yazidi, mostly women and girls, back to Germany. And he said it was one of the most awful tasks. He felt like he was playing God. And he decided to bring each person with one relative, usually an older, not a very old person, he wasn't sure if they would survive, a younger person and a nephew, an older person and a niece, 2 siblings. He brought them back to Germany.
Entonces a él le dieron la tarea de que viajara a Irak para rescatar la mayor cantidad de personas que pudiera y alcanzó a rescatar 1,100 personas, pero él dice que esa es la tarea más difícil que le ha tocado porque básicamente lo que hizo fue pedirle a cada persona que rescatara que solo se trajera un familiar, y así se trajo un familiar, de cada una persona con su familiar, de vuelta a Alemania.
The goal was that they would receive medical and psychological care and safety, and so he provided that, but he took one woman that he knew would die if he didn't take her, and he was describing that to me.
Entonces la meta era que pues en Alemania ellos recibieran tratamiento psicológico y médico, y él se llevó también a una mujer que él sabía que iba a morir si él no la rescataba, y eso pues era lo que me estaba describiendo.
He was asked to go to a refugee tent, and he could smell the appalling odor before he entered the tent.
A él se le pidió que entrara en una carpa, en una tienda, y él describía el olor tan punzante que había antes de entrar a la tienda.
And inside was a young woman who had attempted to burn herself alive because she had been gang raped multiple times and her skin wounds were fully infected. He knew that she would die if he did not take her back.
Y se trataba de una mujer que había tratado de quemarse viva porque la habían violado grupalmente varias veces, y pues sus heridas estaban completamente infectadas, entonces él sabía que él no iba a poderla salvar si él no se la llevaba con él.
All of her family was executed, so he brought her back, and actually they repaired her skin wounds. And when I saw him prior to the pandemic, her one goal with her psychologist was to go into a cafe and eat ice cream without people staring at her, and they were working towards that goal.
Entonces uno de su familia había sido ejecutada, y cuando se la trajeron a Alemania, una de las metas que se propusieron cuando pues se pusieron a trabajar con ella es que pudiera ir a un café y comerse un helado sin que todo el mundo la estuviera mirando.
But he didn't just stop there. He went back to Iraq and built a school of psychotraumatology, because there were still 6,000 or 7,000 Yazidi people trained from the local community. First a counselor in psychology, then a bachelor degree in psychology, then a master's degree in psychology, now doctoral students. And many of those students are survivors of Saddam's genocides on the Kurds. There was the survivors of Halabja, and they themselves also had survived the genocide. So he's created a school of psychotraumatology of genocide survivors, rehabilitating genocide survivors. You must invite him here, and you must visit his center.
Pero él no paró ahí, él después regresó a Irak para construir la escuela de psicotraumatología, porque había más o menos unos 6,000, 7,000 estudiantes que habían sido víctimas del régimen de Saddam, que habían estudiado ciencias afines y que podían hacer un gran trabajo allá. Entonces él crea esa escuela, y realmente es una necesidad que lo podamos invitar a la universidad para que nos cuente su experiencia.
I know we're getting to the end of the time, but I want to talk to you about one thing with the sexual violence and what ISIS did. You may not, does anybody know a Yazidi person? Does anyone have a Yazidi friend or seen a Yazidi person? Yeah. They're a very, very tiny community. I think at the time of the genocide, there were only about 800,000 worldwide. They are exceptionally fair-skinned and blue-eyed. Many of them are blonde. And ISIS ascribed to them a status that they were devil worshippers. So they dehumanized, which is why they murdered these people, but they also were attracted perversely to sexually enslave girls as young as 7 upwards. So I was able to look at the art therapy that they had recovering children do, who were drawing pictures of a maternal figure and blood coming from the genitalia and unhappy faces. So children witnessed the sexual atrocities that were occurring on their mothers.
Pues se está preguntando si alguien aquí conocía algún yazidí, porque son una comunidad muy pequeña, más o menos son 8,000 personas. Y estaba diciendo que ellos pues tienen una piel muy blanca, ojos azules, son el pelo rubio, pero que son bastante atractivos. Entonces los de ISIS lo que hicieron fue pues deshumanizarlos, diciendo que eran adoradores del diablo, pero a su vez se sentían atraídos de una manera muy torcida, muy retorcida hacia estas personas, y terminaban haciendo terminando convirtiendo a las mujeres en esclavas sexuales, hasta el punto en que los niños, ella trabajó mucho con los niños, con el tema de psicodibujos con los niños, y los niños cuando hacían los dibujos dibujaban a las mamás con los genitales sangrando y con las caras tristes, lo que demostraba que los niños tuvieron que presenciar muchas de las atrocidades que se cometieron contra las mujeres de esta comunidad.
And testament to his program and the German government, he often travels now with the German foreign minister, and Germany has its own history with genocide, as you know, in the Holocaust. Not one Yazidi woman or girl that he brought back committed suicide. They've learned German, they have jobs, they're leading relatively normal lives. And he's also made a tremendous impact on the local community in Iraq, but they still live in displaced persons camps.
Él ahora pues hace viajes a Irak pues para mostrar, digamos, parte de esta masacre. También hay una relación ahí por el hecho de que pues Alemania también pues tuvo el tema del holocausto, pero prácticamente todas las mujeres que él trajo a Alemania, ninguna se suicidó y todas en estos momentos están en capacidad, están viviendo unas vidas relativamente normales.
And just to circle, and then I'll close, is things are extremely complicated because when the Syrian war began and the Syrian civil war that Assad perpetuated on his own people, Assad is, I don't know that he would be defined as an Islamist, but he's of a Muslim origin committing a completely devastating civil war on his own people. There was a flow of humanity from Syria into Germany, and many of the Yazidi people recognized former ISIS operatives that came from that region. And so they were again terrorized, living in fear in Germany.
Para cerrar un poco el tema, pues cuando pasó lo de la guerra de Siria con Bashar al-Assad, que pues no es un islamista, pero sí es un dictador, sucedió que hubo un gran flujo de gente de Siria a Alemania, y muchas de las anteriores víctimas de yazidíes reconocieron en algunas caras dentro de ese flujo de gente a antiguos victimarios de ellas, y obviamente esto las hizo sentir otras inseguras y las revictimizó.
Okay, let's move on to the public questions now, just to conclude. Bueno, esperamos preguntas del público, no hay problema, no sean tímidos, español, inglés, aquí está el traductor, así es que los esperamos.
Hola, buenos días. Bueno, yo quiero preguntar algo, bueno, no es más que una pregunta, quiero saber qué tipo de consejos, teniendo en cuenta el contexto de lo que ella ha hablado, que tiene ella por decirnos a nosotros como jóvenes y estudiantes para pues tener un poco más de perspectiva en frente a estos temas como tan, no sé, como tan pesados para la sociedad.
So her question is, what can you tell them as young people so that they can have a broader perspective on these kind of issues for society, and considering that these topics are so difficult?
So I would say the central quality, and it's not just for students, but I think it's for all successful human beings, is intellectual curiosity. And I think you might want to start a program of joint political science and medicine, because I'm telling you about 2 other doctors that were practicing their profession just as you practice your profession, but became very concerned about a geopolitical issue for whatever their motives. So intellectual curiosity is number 1. And intellectual curiosity is one quality that is singularly threatened at the moment when you are all subject to algorithms programmed by social media. I didn't have to grow up with that.
Entonces yo les diría que la primera cosa, o la principal, no solo para los jóvenes sino para todo el mundo, es la curiosidad intelectual. De hecho, debería promoverse un poco más esta unión entre estudiantes de medicina y estudiantes de ciencia política, porque pues acabo de mencionar a 2 doctores que precisamente decidieron meterse en estos temas por la curiosidad intelectual que eso les generó. Entonces la curiosidad intelectual es fundamental, y muchas veces esta se ve limitada o restringida por los algoritmos y las redes sociales.
In fact, I don't know where I learned this, but as a very young, I was a medical student at the age of 17, but we learned very early on, don't trust another doctor in the sense that you must make the diagnosis for yourself. don't come with predetermined diagnosis. Sometimes patients come to me and say, I have this, I have that, I have the other. I say, please don't tell me the diagnosis. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you see in your body. So it's not to be a mistrustful person, but you must make your own determination in every interaction that you're having to satisfy yourself.
Cuando era joven, no recuerdo, más o menos tenía 17 años, aprendí este dicho que dice: nunca confíen en otro doctor en términos del diagnóstico, siempre hagan su propio diagnóstico. Y cuando llegan mis pacientes, yo no les digo que me repitan lo que les dijeron, sino qué están sintiendo, cómo se están sintiendo. Descríbame qué es lo que le está pasando para así poder hacer mi propio diagnóstico, y eso es fundamental.
And it goes back to the scene you're asking me to remember where I saw the child soldiers in Pakistan. So how did they indoctrinate the child soldiers? They opened a Quran. They did not teach them to read Arabic, and they did not provide translation. And they said to the boys, the Quran says you execute anyone in trousers, which is every Westerner, it's every member of the military. They said they are all Shia. They didn't even know what is Sunni and Shia. They brainwashed the children. This is how the Taliban works. This is how the ISIS works.
Tú me preguntabas sobre el tema de los niños reclutados en Pakistán. Pues a los niños reclutados en Pakistán lo que hacían es que les abrían el Corán, pero no les enseñaban ni a leer en árabe ni les traducían. Simplemente les abrían el Corán y les decían: hay que matar a todo el que tenga pantalones, porque todo el que tenga pantalones era un occidental, o era un soldado, o pues básicamente era un enemigo. Y así es como funciona ISIS, así es como indoctrinan a la gente.
So of course, part of the de-radicalization program was you re-educate them with a scholar of Islam that knows Arabic and knows their language and deprograms the brain of the operative. And that is such a threat to the totalitarian Taliban, they executed that scholar.
Entonces, una de las formas de desradicalizar a los militantes era traer a un académico que conociera el tema del Islam, que les enseñara, pero esto fue tal amenaza para el totalitarismo islamista que terminaron ejecutando a los académicos.
And so that tells you that the most threatening quality in a human being to any totalitarian, whether they're Islamist or not, is a critical mind that challenges their calcified ideas.
Y esto lo que viene a demostrar es que la amenaza más grande para cualquier régimen totalitario es una mente crítica que aprenda a discernir intelectualmente.
And if we draw it back to what's happening, what I see in my students, and I'm not speaking here as a faculty member of my medical school, I should have said that right at the start, I'm speaking just as an individual, but what I see in young Americans is there's a real degradation of critical thinking. There is very little challenging discourse, there is a very shortened attention span, and there is a general lack of curiosity about the world beyond your immediate responsibilities. And that's not unique to my students, that's the general environment.
Y lo que estoy notando como persona natural con respecto a mis estudiantes norteamericanos es que hay problemas como falta de atención, falta de curiosidad, falta de discernimiento, y esto no lo veo solo a nivel de jóvenes, sino también lo veo a nivel general.
And actually, I just want to connect that to one other thought process is the Islamists, the brilliant political Islamists. So what I'm showing you is the end point of Islamism, and it could have been a Yazidi body, it could have been an Israeli body, it could have been a Muslim body. That's the nth degree of this ideology. But before that is a foundation of non-violent Islamism, which brings concepts like Islamophobia, on which I've written many essays. And Islamophobia, any demonization of a person based on their religion or their identity in the United States, it's a hate crime, it's prosecuted, it's a xenophobia, the same in Britain, and I reject that. But the concept of Islamophobia is completely novel. There is no evidence in our scripture that there was something called Islamophobia, but it prevents the Muslim Brotherhood ideologue from being scrutinized. You can't even speak about these ideas, which Western powers have now given real force to that political and judicial shield.
Y digamos que un derivado de este problema del islamismo es la islamofobia, que permite darle cierta protección a grupos, por ejemplo, como la Hermandad Musulmana, porque ya tienen una especie de blindaje jurídico cuando se trata de venir a vigilarlos o hacerles algún tipo de investigación.
Yes. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, being so patient. Thank you.
She was first.
First, I want to thank you for taking your time and being here. And I want to ask you two questions that are a little bit related, and is that, how do you feel about everything and see this in person? Because it's different seeing this in photos and seeing this by yourself. And how do you handle all of this emotion and don't get them affected your work?
Thank you. Oh, yes, please. Yes.
Entonces la pregunta es básicamente, ¿cómo te sientes cuando ves esto en persona y cómo haces para que esto no te afecte?
So it's very interesting because I've been immersed in medicine, and I've also been immersed in this parallel to my medicine. I think that there is a therapeutic shield around me because I carry the label doctor, and when I go to my office, I put a uniform on. And then when I'm overseas, I'm not treating any patients, but I still have that metaphorical shield around me where I feel I can look at things and be somewhat dissociated because of the nearly 39 years of being a medical student and then a doctor. So there is some protection that we get through years of training, that we know we are an onlooker, we are witnessing, we are recording, and that creates a little bit of healthy distance. I think that's one.
Entonces, digamos que los doctores, debido a su capacitación, a su formación, ellos tienen una capacidad que les permite de alguna manera disociarse de la realidad a la que ven. Cuando ellos se ponen el uniforme, como que logran tener una especie de escudo, y ella lo que dice es que cuando viaja al exterior, ese escudo como que ella siente que se mantiene con ella, y eso le permite como ver esto de una manera un poco más, que le afecte menos, pues.
I think that psychotherapy and the knowledge I gain from psychotherapy is my superpower. It's a secret superpower, but I think that years of having reflected sense of self from a very brilliant, gifted, and compassionate psychotherapist, it makes me see if I'm absorbing something, if it's damaging, if it's intruding in my sleep. Some of the psychologists that have worked with the de-radicalized children have very disrupted sleep, have significant impacts. You're sort of referring to that in your own story.
Entonces, el otro tema también es el trabajo con la psicoterapia. Después de 20 años de estar en psicoterapia con alguien que además ha sido muy bondadoso y muy generoso, pues ha sido posible determinar también si algo está teniendo un impacto, si algo está afectando. De hecho, hay muchos psicólogos que trabajan también con víctimas que precisamente se enfocan en eso.
And I think also there's a great power in writing. And there's a field of medicine known as narrative medicine, which is about combining literature and art, which is used for patients that may want to get better. It's used for doctors that want to improve their connection. I use narrative medicine in my practice. And that is another catharsis, which is very healthy and can help you externalize and resolve and reorganize suffering that you're encountering.
Y hay otra forma muy poderosa que es la escritura. Escribir es muy poderoso. Hay una figura que se llama la medicina narrativa, que es combinar medicina con literatura. De esta manera se empiezan, por medio de la escritura, digamos, a hacer catarsis con respecto a muchos de los temas pues, personales que se pueden experimentar. Y ella también utiliza mucho la medicina narrativa para lidiar con muchos de los temas con los que tiene que...
And then it comes back to the question of the first colleague in the pink-colored clothing, which is that intellectual curiosity, and the other thing is sense of purpose. I think those are the two guides that will bring you to whatever has meaning. You know the book Viktor Frankl's In Search of Meaning? He was a physician, I think, Viktor Frankl, and he was also in the Holocaust, and he noted that people who had no meaning during this diabolical genocide were more likely to not survive. And human beings can't survive without a sense of purpose. And the algorithms turn you into a consumer of images and take away your ability to reflect and think inwards about your curiosity and your sense of purpose.
Y eso me lleva entonces a la primera pregunta, porque además de la curiosidad intelectual, hay otro tema que es el sentido de propósito, es el propósito. Y Viktor Frankl, que era un doctor, él escribió un libro en el que narró cómo en relación con muchas de las víctimas del Holocausto, la gente que no sentía que tenía propósito era la que moría antes, sí.
You're doing very well, Lo. Very. Yes. 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 I'm amazed you're all still here. If I may ask, I see a student there. For the if that's okay, there's this young student. Is that all right? Oh.
They do have questions.
I see. Okay.
So, but like we
Brief.
running out of
Okay.
time.
So brief.
So,
Please.
you can do short questions. We can have two more.
Okay. Okay, please.
Bueno, mi pregunta es, a la hora de abordar temas como el género y la violencia contra la mujer, pues abordarlos en Occidente es fácil porque tenemos los conceptos, sin embargo, abordar estos temas desde el mundo occidental, en un mundo que está, pues, que es completamente ajeno al nuestro, es complicado, y mi pregunta sería, ¿cómo podemos abordar el tema de género y violencia contra la mujer sin caer en usar conceptos occidentalizados que han sido hechos por y para mujeres occidentales, que no tienen nada que ver con lo que ellas hacen y que tienen sus propias luchas y sus particularidades? ¿Y cómo podemos, pues sí, hacerlo de forma que sea respetuosa con su cultura, con sus creencias, con sus propias luchas, y que no caigamos en occidentalizar su feminidad y su vivencia, pues, como mujeres?
So the question is, we address the issues of violence, gender violence, as Westerners, but how can we address them in other cultures without, like, Westernizing, if I could use the term, those other cultures?
We're going to let her ask the other question, so you answer both of them at the same time. No, tú, ¿no?
Hi, thank you. I had a question about, thank you so much for your talk. It was absolutely inspiring. I wanted to hear about your perspective on the future. I am really concerned with the world that the next generations will have. And I'm wondering, I'm a first-year medical student and I'm a psychologist, and I'm just wondering if you have any ideas of if the world is ready to handle so much trauma, and what would public health systems or governments take into account to handle the amount of trauma that will come? Thanks so much.
Yes, yeah. So regarding the question about how to handle these issues, as a Westerner, what I'm describing to you has been brought to my attention by people that are Pakistani, Iraqi, Kurdish, Yazidi. I would not consider any of them Westerners. I've been a Westerner that's been able to go to those places and see them, and then I write about them in English. But I think that we don't want to be too confined in our bias, that because we have a certain identity, we are not able to broadcast what may be happening to a group that has less influence in public opinion, less space, less opportunity. I don't think that diminishes them in any way, even though I understand the intention of your question. I also think that learning from experts from those groups, obviously I'm telling you, oh yes, I keep forgetting this. Yes.
Sí,
obviously,
ella
got a
dice pues
blind
que
spot.
ya básicamente con respecto a la occidentalización, ella pues realmente ha tenido que tratar con iraquíes, con pakistaníes, con yazidíes, que en realidad no son occidentales y los ha podido tratar de manera normal. Hay que pues tener presente también que no se va a poder, o sea, los grupos minoritarios hay que tratarlos como grupos minoritarios siempre, pero pues hay que ser conscientes también de que hay una identidad propia pues que no se va a imponer a los otros.
In fact, even these scenes are from Israel, and there is now a raging conflict between Israel and Hamas. And Israel is labeled as a Western nation and identifies as a Western nation, but I also spoke with Bedouin Arab members of the Israeli military who described to me sexual violence they saw on the bodies of Bedouin women on October 7th. So this narrow construct of what is West and what is East and who has the authority to speak or describe is very limiting, and I would encourage you not to be limited by it. And your question indicates that you're a very humane and mature person, and I don't think that you should necessarily feel inhibited from being involved in those issues.
Entonces yo estuve trabajando en Israel también en este problema. Israel se considera un país occidental, pero no solo estoy trabajando con los israelíes, sino también con beduinos, con militares, con gente que narraba lo que estaba pasando en términos de violencia sexual con mujeres que hacían parte de las palestinas y las musulmanas. Entonces, este concepto occidental tal vez es un concepto muy limitante y no deberíamos sentirnos limitados por el concepto. Es un consejo que quiero dar porque se nota que esto demuestra que hay mucha humanidad en uno, pero no puede uno dejarse limitar por estas cosas porque puede terminar bastante parcializado.
Thank you. And going back to the first year medical student, I would say keep going. It's a big degree to get, and I'm very excited that you are here. You are not alone in that. There are many people in Colombia who've asked me this question, and particularly as this week when I arrived, we saw this devastating aerial assault from Iran that was targeting Israel, but involved and went over the airspace of many Middle Eastern nations. In fact, it had all of the world leaders' hair standing on end, and everybody is sharing that sentiment. People are asking me if there's going to be a third world war. Will humanity survive? If you want to translate that, and then I'll see.
Entonces, con respecto a la pregunta de la estudiante de primer año, pues hay que seguir, que es un honor que estés acá. Mucha gente en Colombia está haciéndose esta pregunta, ya le han hecho mucho esta pregunta porque pues después del ataque iraní a Israel, pues la gente se está empezando a preguntar si va a haber una tercera guerra mundial y qué es lo que va a pasar, así que este es un sentimiento que es muy compartido y muy común.
In fact, even this morning before I came here, I came from a meeting with congresswomen and senators of your country, and they also asked the same question. So the highest ranking political officials that are Colombian women in this country are thinking of the same thing. But I think that maybe if we can close on an optimistic note after we've seen gruesome experiences, is that one thing I've learned is the extraordinary resilience of humanity and of the human spirit. The fact that the Yazidi girl who had set fire to herself after gang rapes now is in Germany and is moving towards an ice cream in a cafe is a testimony to resilience. I think humanity will never lose that characteristic. I also think No matter what we see, the new style of warfare is proxy warfare. We've seen proxy warfare in Syria. We're seeing proxy warfare in Ukraine. And I believe the war that is Hamas and Israel is an Iranian proxy war. So even though there are proxy wars that are going on, I don't believe the world's superpowers are willing to risk their own existence in a vain project to eliminate humanity to satisfy their ego, no matter who those leaders are. So I think our desire to survive as human beings is so strong that even though we have so much violence that's part of humanity, we still have resilience to keep going.
Entonces, pues esta pregunta me la hicieron también unos congresistas esta mañana cuando estaba reunido con ellos, lo que implica que hasta los grandes funcionarios mujeres del sistema colombiano pues están interesados en esto, les preocupa esto, pero yo creo que uno de los aspectos de la realidad humana que va a terminar prevaleciendo es la resiliencia, y esa resiliencia la vimos en esta mujer que se intentó prender fuego y terminó comiendo un helado en Alemania en un café. Demuestra cómo el espíritu humano puede salir adelante y puede sobreponerse, y pues no creo que los Estados Unidos y ni ninguna de las grandes potencias realmente vayan a garantizar su aniquilamiento. Y lo que estamos viendo son los proxy wars, que son las guerras por intermedio de drones y demás, como pasó en Siria y como pasó en tantos otros lados, y probablemente el espíritu humano pues va a triunfar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perdón, un segundito, perdón. No me puedo permitir que ustedes se vayan, no me lo perdonaría sin invitarles a que conozcan el informe de la Comisión de la Verdad, para el esclarecimiento de la verdad, que está en el Centro de Memoria, Paz y Reconciliación, en la 26 con 30. Si no conocemos el contexto propio, este tipo de información puede caer en el vacío. Es importante además para mí rescatar el hecho de que las preguntas que ustedes hicieron, muchas para los estudiantes de medicina se van a resolver a fondo en cuarto semestre. Salud mental comunitaria les prepara para informarles cómo cuidarse, porque un médico colombiano difícilmente va a quedar excluido de estos escenarios. Es muy seguro que le toque la atención en forense, pero también la atención en el apoyo psicosocial. Y entonces entiendan que esto los compromete de alguna manera para seguir teniendo esa curiosidad intelectual que expresa la doctora Qanta como una fortaleza de alguien que quiere profundizar en este tema y transformar y hacer algo. Gracias. Era eso, la invitación al centro. Gracias.